Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time before blue light filters, lavender teas, and podcasts about Roman emperors with questionable dental hygiene. Instead, we're stepping quietly into the ancient world, where sleep was as elusive and frustrating as it is today. Yes, insomnia is not a modern invention. People 2,000 years ago also stared at the ceiling, though theirs was usually smoke-stained wood or cold stone, and wondered why their brains refused to shut off. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's take a calm, meandering stroll through the surprisingly creative, occasionally absurd, and occasionally poisonous ways ancient people tried to coax themselves into slumber, or to keep nightmares away once they actually managed to fall asleep. The first thing to understand is that, in ancient times, sleeplessness wasn't usually blamed on stress, caffeine, or scrolling through doom-laden news feeds at 1 a.m. It was more often considered a spiritual problem, something in the air, or in the body, or perhaps lurking invisibly in the room. The solution, naturally, was to fight it with charms, prayers, and a liberal sprinkling of substances that would probably kill us today. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia. Here, insomnia was believed to be caused by spirits, specifically, malicious ones that crept into bedrooms uninvited. These spirits weren't dramatic like the horror movie kind. They were more subtle. They might whisper, hover, or simply disturb the sleeper's body enough to prevent rest. To ward them off, people placed little clay figurines beneath their beds. These figures acted as decoys or bodyguards, tiny night shift workers whose job was to stare creepily at invisible forces so you could relax. Incantations were another favorite. A priest might stand over the troubled insomniac, muttering lines that sound suspiciously like poetry, though less Shakespeare and more please. Leave this man alone, evil spirit. He has to get up early. Sometimes herbs were burned alongside these chants, filling the room with smoke thick enough to either purify the air or simply choke everyone into drowsiness. The Egyptians, as usual, took things in their own special direction. Nightmares were a serious issue in their worldview. They believed that dreams were messages from the gods, or sometimes from the restless dead. A nightmare wasn't just an inconvenience. It might mean the gods were angry, or that some forgotten uncle in the afterlife was trying to send a message about unpaid funeral offerings. To keep the bad dreams away, Egyptians often wore one popular charm featured the image of Base, a dwarf god with a protruding tongue and a face like an angry pug. He wasn't beautiful, but he was effective. Placing Base near the bed was believed to terrify demons so thoroughly that they left the sleeper in peace. So if you were an ancient Egyptian child afraid of the dark, instead of a soft teddy bear, you'd cuddle up with a carving of a bulging-eyed goblin dwarf, comforting in its own way. And then there were remedies you could ingest. Egyptian medical papyri list drinks made with poppy seeds, lettuce, and sometimes even wine mixed with herbs. Yes, lettuce. For reasons unclear, lettuce was associated with both fertility and sleep, which are not usually things we'd like to combine. But the Egyptians rarely worried about contradictions. Moving over to Greece, we find perhaps the most famous ancient sleep aid enthusiast, Hippocrates. Yes, the do no harm guy, which is a bit ironic, because many of his recommended treatments involved substances that absolutely did harm, especially to the liver. For Greeks, insomnia was a matter of bodily imbalance. Too much heat in the brain, too much bile, or perhaps the stomach being too full. One solution was diet regulation. Eat lightly, avoid heavy meats at night, and maybe go for a little walk before bed. Not terrible advice, though they also suggested vomiting as a way to lighten the body before sleep. Less charming. If that didn't work, there was always opium. The Greeks had no qualms about recommending poppy juice for the sleepless. It worked quickly, it worked effectively, and yes, it worked addictively. But if you were tossing and turning on a rough straw mattress in a noisy Athenian house, perhaps opium tea felt like a gift from the gods. The Romans inherited these ideas, but, naturally, added their own dramatic flair. They loved amulets, but they also believed in rituals that bordered on performance art. One Roman remedy for insomnia involved writing down the name of the god, Morpheus, the god of dreams, on a piece of paper, then tying it to your head before going to bed. Imagine your partner rolling over at night and finding you with a little scroll strapped to your forehead. Romantic. They also believed in sympathetic magic. For example, to prevent nightmares, one might place a key under the pillow. The logic was that the key locked the bad dreams out. Of course, it could also stab you in the ear if you turned over too quickly. But Romans weren't known for their ergonomic choices. Then there were household remedies. A Roman might drink warm wine mixed with herbs like valerian or chamomile. Or, if things were truly desperate, they might turn to more exotic substances. Powdered emeralds, for instance, dissolved in water, very luxurious. Probably very bad for your kidneys. Nightmares themselves were often seen as omens. If you dreamed of being chased, or of falling, it wasn't just your brain playing tricks, it was the universe dropping hints. Ancient dream manuals, which survive in fragments, list hundreds of such interpretations. Dream of your teeth falling out. It might mean a relative will die. Dream of flying. Congratulations. It means fortune. Dream of being naked in public. Well, that's been awkward for at least 2,000 years, because dreams were seen as messages. People sometimes went to temples specifically to sleep. This was called incubation. The most famous example was at the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. Patients would lie down in the temple, sometimes surrounded by snakes, because that was Asclepius's thing, and hope for a healing dream. The priests would then help interpret the dream and prescribe a cure. Whether or not it helped insomnia is debatable, but lying in a dark temple full of hissing reptiles seems more likely to cause it. Let's drift a little eastward, to India and China. Both cultures had rich traditions of dream interpretation and sleep remedies. In Ayurvedic medicine, insomnia was often linked to an excess of wind or imbalance in the doshas. Treatments included warm oil massages, drinking milk with nutmeg, or repeating mantras before bed. There's something rather soothing about the idea of an ancient Indian household, with someone gently rubbing sesame oil into their scalp by lamplight, whispering prayers to lull themselves into rest. China, meanwhile, turned to acupuncture, herbs, and qigong breathing techniques. Texts from the Han Dynasty recommend placing the bed in certain directions to encourage peaceful dreams. If you suffered nightmares, it might be due to restless ancestral spirits, so offerings of food and incense were advised. One particularly poetic cure involved writing your nightmare on a piece of paper, then burning it, so the smoke carried it away. It's hard not to like that one. Symbolic, calming, and less liver damaging than drinking ground emeralds. Of course, not all remedies were gentle. Some were downright alarming. In medieval Europe, just to peek ahead, nightmares were blamed on demons called incubi and succubi. These creatures supposedly sat on your chest while you slept, suffocating you, which, coincidentally, is almost exactly how sleep paralysis feels. To ward them off, people placed iron objects in their rooms, sprinkled holy water on their beds, or simply slept sitting up, which doesn't sound restful at all, but at least you avoided supernatural harassment. Back in antiquity, though the boundaries between medical, magical, and spiritual approaches were fluid, if a priest's chant didn't work, you could always try a physician's potion. If the potion failed, perhaps an amulet of base or a Roman key would help. The important thing was not whether it worked scientifically, but whether it reassured the restless mind enough to drift into slumber. And, just as today, some people simply accepted insomnia as part of life. We have records of Roman philosophers pacing their villas at night, scribbling notes by lamplight, sighing about their lack of rest. Seneca, the ever-grumpy Stoic, wrote about sleepless nights filled with anxious thoughts, noting that sometimes the only cure was to stop caring, which is easy advice to give when you have a villa and several servants, and less helpful when you're stuck in a noisy insula with neighbors shouting through the walls. But in a way, These ancient strategies remind us of something simple. Insomnia has always been with us. The desire to sleep peacefully and the fear of bad dreams has haunted humans for thousands of years. And while our cures today might involve melatonin gummies and white noise machines, we're not so far removed from the people who clutched amulets, whispered prayers, and hoped that tonight finally their restless minds would quiet. So, if you're lying awake right now, listening to this, know that you are participating in a very old tradition, a line stretching back through centuries of sleepless emperors, anxious scribes, and ordinary people with tired eyes. And if the ancient world teaches us anything, it's that there's always one more strange little ritual to try. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, first of all, I'm impressed. Second, let's keep floating through the centuries. We've already seen how the Egyptians trusted in dwarf gods, the Greeks sipped opium tea, and the Romans tied magical words to their foreheads like very committed fortune cookies. Now, let's drift into the dimly lit halls of medieval Europe, where sleeplessness took on a distinctly Christian and, occasionally rather Gothic flavor. For medieval people, insomnia was rarely treated as a purely physical problem. No one was lying awake thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't have eaten that 16th sausage. Instead, if you couldn't sleep, the likely culprit was sin, or demons, or both, because in medieval Europe, everything somehow circled back to sin and demons. Nightmares, in particular, were often seen as spiritual attacks. The word nightmare itself comes from the Old English mare, meaning a demon or spirit that presses down on the sleeper's chest. Imagine waking up from sleep paralysis, heart racing, body frozen, and deciding the most logical explanation was that a goblin just sat on you. In fairness, this theory caught on. The mare became a familiar figure across Europe. In Germany, she was Die Nachtmar, a witch-like figure who snuck into homes at night. In Scandinavia, she was the Mara, who rode horses in their stables until they foamed with sweat. And in England, she eventually gave us the word nightmare, a problem shared across cultures, explained in a way that was equal parts terrifying and poetic. So, what did people do about it? Well, one strategy was protection through objects. Iron was considered particularly effective against nocturnal demons. Horseshoes above doors, iron knives under pillows, or even scissors opened in the shape of a cross and placed beside the bed. Yes, nothing says sweet dreams like sleeping next to a pair of open scissors. Holy water was another favorite. Sprinkling the bed, the room, or even one's own face before sleep was thought to keep nightmares away. This might have worked mostly because you ended up damp and uncomfortable, and thus too distracted to notice your dreams. If you had the resources, you might also request prayers. Monks were often asked to recite psalms on behalf of insomnia. Psalm 4 was especially popular. I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Reassuring words. Unless you'd just been told that goblins were probably squatting on your chest. But medieval cures weren't all spiritual. There were also practical remedies. Herbal concoctions played a huge role in medieval medicine. Valerian root was a common choice, believed to calm the nervous system. Poppy seeds and opium made appearances as well, though always with the helpful note, administer cautiously, which, given medieval dosage standards, probably meant guess and hope they don't die. One recipe from a 12th century English medical text suggests a drink of lettuce juice mixed with rosewater and vinegar, because nothing says good night like sipping on salad dressing. Other remedies were surprisingly gentle. Lavender, chamomile, and lemon balm were all known and recommended for restlessness. If you've ever tried modern sleepy tea, you're basically sipping on the same plants that medieval apothecaries suggested. The difference is that theirs might also have included ingredients like ground pearls or powdered stag antler. Luxurious, but not exactly essential. Let's not forget about nighttime rituals. Many medieval households believed it was important to prepare the mind before bed. Reading scripture, reciting prayers, or making the sign of the cross before sleep were common. One particularly charming superstition advised turning one's shoes upside down by the bed. This confused the demons, apparently, who would spend all night trying to figure out why your footwear was misbehaving instead of bothering you. And if all else failed, there was always alcohol. Wine and ale were the medieval sedatives of choice. Doctors sometimes advised warm spiced wine as a nighttime drink, which was pleasant enough. Unfortunately, moderation was rarely observed, and the line between nightcap and collapsing in a drunken heap was thin. Yes, some medieval people solved insomnia by simply drinking until their bodies gave up, a tactic not entirely unfamiliar today. Now, moving into the early modern period, roughly the 16th to 18th centuries, we find insomnia being taken more seriously as a medical issue, partly because Europe was suddenly filled with people. Coffee arrived from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, and by the 17th century it was all the rage. People who had never consumed anything more stimulating than weak ale were suddenly downing several cups of coffee and wondering why they couldn't sleep. Physicians began writing about wakefulness disorders with a sense of bafflement. It turns out that chugging hot bean juice at midnight is not conducive to restful slumber. Who knew? Nightmares, meanwhile, were increasingly medicalized. Instead of being blamed entirely on demons, they were sometimes attributed to indigestion. A heavy supper, rich in meat and cheese, could lead to unsettling dreams. This was the era when people began to say, "Don't eat too much before bed, or you'll have nightmares." It wasn't spiritual, it was stomach acid. Progress, of a sort. But spiritual explanations didn't vanish. In Protestant Europe, sleeplessness could be read as a sign of guilt or divine punishment. A godly person slept soundly, a sinful one tossed and turned, which must have been reassuring if you were lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and realizing that, apparently, you were damned. Catholics, on the other hand, continued to favor protective charms and saintly invocations. Saint Dymphna, for example, was sometimes invoked for sleep and mental health. Other people simply relied on crucifixes, rosaries, and holy relics tucked beneath the pillow. And then there were the medical entrepreneurs. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of patent medicines, bottled concoctions sold as miracle cures for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Naturally, many claimed to treat insomnia. Most were mixtures of alcohol, opium, and exotic-sounding herbs, which means they worked. If by worked, you mean knocked you unconscious and left you with a monumental hangover. One interesting development was the idea of sleep hygiene, though they wouldn't have used that phrase. Early modern physicians began recommending habits for better sleep. Keep a regular schedule, avoid heavy food late at night, make sure your bed is comfortable and your room quiet. It sounds remarkably modern, except that beds were often stuffed with straw, and quiet was relative when your neighbor's pigs lived 2 feet from your window. Still, the principle was sound, and some households did their best to create restful spaces. Herbs like lavender and rosemary were tucked into pillows. Curtains were drawn to block out drafts. The wealthy even employed bedchamber attendants, servants whose job it was to ensure the master's room was suitably arranged for rest. Nothing says relaxation like having 3 people fussing over your blanket before you can lie down. Nightmares in the early modern imagination also had a fascinating overlap with witchcraft. It was widely believed that witches could cause bad dreams by sending their spirits out at night. Victims described being smothered, pressed, or ridden by invisible forces. This belief gave rise to the image of the witch's ride, where a woman was accused of flying at night, tormenting her neighbors in their sleep. So if you complained too often about nightmares, you might accidentally spark a witch trial, which, one assumes, did not help your insomnia. By the 18th century, insomnia was sometimes linked with intellectual activity. Philosophers and poets liked to portray themselves as tormented by sleeplessness, pacing their candlelit studies in deep thought. Voltaire was famously sleepless, though given the gallons of coffee he consumed each day. This is not surprising. He is said to have drunk up to 40 cups daily. That's less insomnia and more chemical warfare. For others, insomnia was a mark of sensitivity. The romantic notion of the suffering genius, awake at night with his troubled thoughts, became fashionable, which meant that sleeplessness, once a curse, could also be worn as a badge of intellectual honor, though it still left you groggy in the morning, genius or not. So, what have we learned from this midnight ramble through medieval and early modern Europe? That people sprinkled holy water on their beds, drank salad-flavored potions, and kept open scissors under their pillows. That coffee both revolutionized and ruined sleep. That nightmares were sometimes indigestion, sometimes demons, and sometimes just unlucky enough to spark a witch hunt. And that through it all, the desire was the same as ours, to close one's eyes, quiet the mind, and rest. The details change. The rituals change, the excuses for staying awake change, but the human frustration of lying awake while the world sleeps, that hasn't changed at all. So, if you're still with me, still awake, take comfort in knowing that your sleeplessness links you with a long, strange history, with monks sprinkling holy water, peasants clutching iron scissors, and philosophers muttering into their coffee at 3 a.m. Not the most restful company, but company nonetheless. Hey again. If you're still here, still listening, and still awake, I'd like to congratulate you. You've already endured the Middle Ages with their scissors under the pillow remedies, and early modern Europe with its caffeinated philosophers. Now we're moving gently into the 19th century, an era that liked to describe itself as modern, but still thought leeches were a reasonable medical tool. This was a world transformed by industrialization, urban noise, gas lamps, and eventually, electricity. Suddenly, people weren't just kept awake by demons or indigestion. They were kept awake by trains rattling past their windows, factories that clanked all night, and, eventually, the steady hum of electric light bulbs that stretched day into night. Insomnia, which had always been there, now became a genuine social problem. Doctors of the 19th century were obsessed with cataloging new illnesses. They loved nothing more than taking an ordinary human complaint, giving it a Latin name, and then prescribing something dreadful for it. Insomnia was no exception. It was classified as a neurosis, a nervous disorder brought on by modern life. Too much reading, too much thinking, too much city living, all of these could keep you awake. So, naturally, the cure was to stop doing all of those things. Medical textbooks of the era advised patients to cut back on mental exertion. If you were sleepless, it was probably because you'd been studying too hard, or heaven forbid writing poetry late into the night. The solution was to sit quietly, avoid stimulating conversation, and take gentle walks. Basically, they were prescribing boredom. Of course, not everyone wanted boredom. Some wanted chemical solutions. And the 19th century was all too happy to provide. Let's start with chloral hydrate. First, synthesized in 1832, this became one of the first widely used hypnotic drugs, meaning it could put you to sleep, whether you wanted to or not. By the late 19th century, chloral hydrate was a fashionable prescription. Doctors recommended it for insomniacs, anxious patients, and even children who refused to sleep. Yes, people were dosing their toddlers with industrial-strength sedatives, because why sing a lullaby when you can reach for chemistry? Chloral hydrate did work. It knocked people out effectively. Unfortunately, it was also addictive, caused terrifying hallucinations, and sometimes killed patients outright, which made it, slightly less ideal. Then came barbiturates. Introduced in the 1860s, barbiturates were hailed as a miracle cure for sleeplessness, anxiety, and just about anything else. Doctors praised them as modern, scientific, and safe, which is always a bad sign, because of course, they turned out to be addictive as well. By the early 20th century, barbiturate dependency was quietly ruining lives, though doctors preferred not to mention that part in the brochures. So yes, if you think modern sleep aids come with concerning side effects, you can take comfort in The fact that at least you're not being prescribed Victorian chloroform cocktails. But drugs weren't the only solutions. The 19th century also embraced the new science of sleep hygiene. Doctors began writing guides for how to prepare one's environment for rest. Some of the advice was genuinely sensible. Keep the bedroom dark and cool. Avoid eating rich food late at night. Stick to a regular schedule. Other advice was less sensible. One guide recommended that insomniacs should avoid featherbeds, as they were too stimulating. Another suggested that women should remove corsets before sleeping, which, while obvious, was apparently considered cutting-edge advice. And then there was the noise problem. City dwellers were tormented by carriages, street vendors, and, eventually, automobiles, so inventors rushed to create gadgets for the sleepless. One 19th century entrepreneur patented padded headgear, essentially the world's first noise-cancelling earmuffs. Imagine strapping bulky leather cushions to your head every night just to drown out the clatter of horses. Not elegant, but perhaps effective. Religion, of course, didn't vanish from the picture. Christian writers continued to frame insomnia as a test of faith. Prayer manuals encouraged those lying awake to recite psalms quietly until they drifted off. One 19th century devotional even suggested that insomnia was a blessing, because it gave the sufferer more time to think about God, which is one way of looking at it. A very pious, very sleep-deprived way of looking at it. But the Victorians had another obsession: the nervous system. They believed insomnia was often a sign of nervous exhaustion, a fashionable diagnosis also known as neurasthenia. If you were wealthy, sleepless, and pale, congratulations, you had neurasthenia. The cure was usually a rest cure, which involved being sent away to a sanatorium, where you were fed, bathed, and sometimes strapped to a bed until you recovered. Because nothing says restful sleep like being forcibly confined in a medical spa. For women, the rest cure was particularly common. Doctors like Silas Ware Mitchell in America prescribed months of bed rest, isolation, and rich food for sleepless and anxious women. The treatment often drove patients mad with boredom. Charlotte Perkins Gilman famously wrote The Yellow Wallpaper after enduring this cure, describing how it nearly broke her sanity. So, not exactly the most relaxing way to handle a few bad nights of sleep. Now, moving into the early 20th century, we find insomnia increasingly medicalized. It was no longer just a nuisance. It was a condition to be measured, studied, and treated. Doctors began recommending sleep diaries, where patients tracked their habits. They were asked to note what they ate, when they went to bed, and how often they woke up. Which may sound familiar, since sleep tracking apps today do the exact same thing, only with fewer fountain pens and more Bluetooth. Technology also entered the bedroom in new ways. Electric lighting extended the day, but it also disrupted natural rhythms. Doctors worried that people were staying up too late under artificial light and ruining their sleep. They weren't wrong. The modern curse of glowing screens has a long ancestor in the humble light bulb. At the same time, mechanical devices for insomnia multiplied. There were vibrating chairs meant to relax the nervous system, electric head massagers promising to lull you into slumber, even experimental machines that emitted low hums, designed to mimic the soothing sound of the ocean. Basically, white noise machines, only with a far greater risk of electrocution. Nightmares, too, were reinterpreted in the early 20th century. Enter Freud. For Freud, dreams were not messages from gods or demons. They were messages from your own subconscious. A nightmare wasn't a witch pressing on your chest. It was your brain acting out unresolved anxieties, usually of the sort you'd rather not discuss at family dinner. This was both liberating and unsettling. On the one hand, no more demons. On the other, now you had to blame yourself. Freud and his followers sometimes recommended dream analysis for chronic nightmare sufferers, which meant long conversations about your childhood, your parents, and your questionable feelings about both. It may not have helped you sleep, but it certainly gave you something to think about while staring at the ceiling. The 20th century also saw The rise of commercial sleep aids, pills, syrups, and powders flooded the market. Some were legitimate medicines, many were not. Advertisements promised miraculous results. One 1920s AD claimed that a particular powder would guarantee refreshing slumber without fail, because it contained no harmful drugs. In reality, it was basically barbiturates and sugar. Consumers woke up groggy, addicted, and sometimes not at all. But the packaging was very persuasive. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued to share home remedies. In the countryside, folk traditions persisted, putting a sprig of rosemary under the pillow, drinking warm milk before bed, reciting rhymes to ward off evil spirits. Even as science advanced, people still clung to small rituals, because, sometimes, ritual is just as important as chemistry. So by the early 20th century, insomnia had become a recognized medical and social problem. It was treated with everything from barbiturates to dream analysis, from vibrating chairs to padded earmuffs. Some cures were dangerous, some were laughable, and a few were quietly effective. But the story remained the same as it had been for thousands of years. Humans, lying awake at night, trying anything, absolutely anything to find rest. And if you're still awake now, perhaps you can take comfort in knowing that you've just joined a very distinguished company. The sleepless Victorians pacing their gaslit studies, the patients in sanatoriums, counting cracks in the ceiling, the Freud-obsessed insomniacs, trying to decide if their nightmares were secretly about their mothers, all of them staring at the dark, wishing for sleep, exactly as we do now. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If so, congratulations, you've officially outlasted the medieval goblins, the Victorian chloroform, and Freud's endlessly awkward dream interpretations. Now we're easing into the world that looks suspiciously like our own, the late 20th century and beyond. This is where sleep moves out of the hands of priests, witches, and apothecaries, and into the hands of scientists in lab coats. Though, naturally, it turns out that science is not much better at actually helping us sleep, but they do provide excellent charts. By the 1950s, sleep was no longer just a personal problem, it was a research field. Doctors and psychologists began wiring people up with electrodes, measuring brainwaves while they dozed uncomfortably in hospital beds. The invention of the EEG electroencephalogram allowed researchers to observe the rhythms of the sleeping brain. This is where we discovered REM sleep in 1953, rapid eye movement, a stage of sleep where the brain lights up with activity while the body lies still. The discovery was revolutionary. Finally, dreams weren't just subjective ramblings, they were measurable, trackable, almost respectable. Of course, this also meant that people who had been happily ignoring their dreams were now told that they were missing out on vital neurological processes. Suddenly, failing to dream was not just dull, it was unhealthy. As research progressed, insomnia was reclassified from nervous disorder into an actual medical condition, with subcategories, diagnostic criteria, and inevitably, drugs. Barbiturates, which had quietly ruined so many lives, were phased out. In their place came the benzodiazepines Valium, Librium, and their many siblings. Doctors in the 1960s and 70s prescribed them liberally. They were marketed as safe, modern, and non-addictive, which, as history shows us, is medical code for "give it 20 years and we'll regret this." Sure enough, benzodiazepines turned out to be addictive too. Patients developed tolerance, dependency, and withdrawal symptoms. But for a while, Valium was the miracle pill of the age. Housewives, businessmen, and insomniacs everywhere popped their little tablets and drifted off, sometimes into sleep, sometimes into chemical haze. By the 1980s, yet another generation of sleep drugs appeared. The so-called Z, better known as Ambien, became a household name. It promised quick sleep with fewer side effects, and it did deliver sleep. It also delivered bizarre side effects, such as sleepwalking, sleep driving, and in some cases, sleep cooking entire meals, before waking up to find your kitchen covered in melted cheese. Still, It was considered progress. Meanwhile, sleep itself had become a public obsession. The late 20th century was the golden age of the sleep clinic. Hospitals set up special units where patients could be observed overnight. If you couldn't sleep at home, why not try in a sterile room while being filmed by strangers? Very relaxing. These clinics produced mountains of data. They revealed disorders like sleep apnea where people stop breathing repeatedly during the night. They catalogued parasomnias like sleepwalking and night terrors. And they confirmed that yes, insomnia is maddening, but no, it does not usually kill you, which is a comfort, in a very bleak way. Alongside the clinical approach came the rise of sleep hygiene manuals for ordinary people. Books and pamphlets advised the same basic principles. Keep a consistent bedtime, limit caffeine, reserve the bed for sleep, not work. All good advice. Though of course, very few people followed it. Because if people actually did follow medical advice, doctors would be out of a job. The 1990s brought a new hero of the natural world, melatonin. This hormone, produced by the pineal gland, helps regulate circadian rhythms. By the late 20th century, scientists realized you could also sell it in pill form at pharmacies. Melatonin quickly became the darling of the insomnia crowd. It was marketed as natural, safe, and effective, which was partly true. It did help some people, particularly with jet lag. Others found it about as useful as chewing on a vitamin gummy, but at least it didn't usually kill anyone, which, compared to chloral hydrate, was progress. And then there were the gadgets. The 20th century was a golden age for insomnia contraptions. White noise machines appeared in bedrooms, filling the night with the soothing roar of artificial oceans. Earplugs and eye masks became standard travel companions. Weighted blankets began circulating, promising to simulate the comforting embrace of a very heavy ghost. There were even light therapy lamps for people with circadian rhythm disorders. Sit in front of a bright box for 20 minutes, and your brain might finally realize it's daytime. The line between medicine and home decor became increasingly blurry. Culturally, sleeplessness also took on new meanings. In the age of round-the-clock capitalism, insomnia became a symbol of productivity. Business magazines in the 1980s and 90s praised CEOs who only slept 4 hours a night. Sleep was painted as laziness. Insomnia was framed as dedication. If you were tired, it meant you were working hard enough, or at least, that was the narrative. Of course. By the 2000s, health experts realized this was a terrible idea. Sleep deprivation was linked to heart disease, diabetes, and general crankiness. Suddenly, sleep went from waste of time to miracle health hack. Magazines flipped their script, urging readers to get 8 hours or risk instant death. The pendulum swung, as it always does. Nightmares, too, entered new territory. Psychologists began treating recurring nightmares with techniques like imagery, rehearsal therapy. Instead of sprinkling holy water or blaming witches, patients were asked to rewrite their nightmares while awake, changing the ending. For example, if you always dream of being chased, you rehearse a new ending where you escape, or even fight back. It's not as dramatic as iron scissors under the pillow, but it does seem to work. By the late 20th century, popular culture was full of sleepless characters. Novels and films portrayed insomniacs as alienated, thoughtful, or dangerous. Think of Fight Club, where insomnia drives the narrator to madness, and underground boxing, or countless detective dramas where the hero can't sleep because of trauma, responsibility, or simply too much brooding. Sleeplessness became an aesthetic, a shorthand for tortured intelligence, though in reality, it mostly just means you're cranky and bad at math the next morning. So where are we now? The modern world is full of sleep solutions. Apps that track your movements, podcasts that drone on for hours in soothing voices, smart mattresses that adjust themselves in the night, essential oil diffusers that promise peace through misty lavender, and, of course, a booming industry of supplements, pills, and therapies. Yet despite all this, insomnia remains stubbornly common. We're just as restless as the Egyptians, the Romans, and the Victorians. We still toss and turn. We still wake from strange dreams. We still reach for remedies, though these days it's more likely to be melatonin gummies than iron scissors. Perhaps the irony is that modern life makes sleep harder, even as we study it more. The glow of screens, the pace of work, the endless stream of information, they all conspire to keep us awake. In some ways, we're more sleepless than ever, but at least we have white noise machines. So, if you're lying there right now, listening, in the dark, know this: you are part of a long and noble history of sleepless humans. From Mesopotamian priests chanting at evil spirits, to medieval peasants clutching holy water, to Victorians swallowing dubious powders, and finally, to you staring at your phone at midnight, wondering if melatonin gummies really do anything. Story hasn't changed much. We've just updated the packaging. Hey everyone, we've wandered a long road together, or perhaps a long bed. From clay tablets in Mesopotamia to sleep clinics glowing with fluorescent light. And the story of insomnia hasn't really changed, just wears different costumes. Let's settle in and float through a final reflection. No more sharp turns, just a gentle review of how humans have always wrestled with the same nightly puzzle. Why can't we just sleep? If you drift back far enough, you'll remember our ancient ancestors. They saw sleeplessness as a visitation. Nightmares were demons. Restless nights meant angry gods or offended spirits. The cures were charms, offerings, or the occasional ritual. Slaughter of a sheep, effective? Probably not. But at least it gave people something to do at 3 in the morning. The medieval world gave us its own flavor. Here, sleeplessness was often tangled with religion. Monks lay awake counting sins. Villagers clutched holy relics and muttered prayers into the dark. And if the prayers didn't work, they tried stronger measures like amulets, herbs, or sprinkling a bit of holy water in the bedclothes. If nothing else, it added some ambience, and of course, people still believed in spirits sitting on their chests, succubi, incubi, or the ever-present old hag. It wasn't called sleep paralysis yet. It was just another excuse to blame the neighbor you already disliked. By the Renaissance and early modern age, sleeplessness had become slightly more medical. Physicians recommended warm baths, bland diets, or the careful balancing of humors. Bloodletting for the insomniac, because nothing says soothing bedtime quite like losing a pint of blood. At the same time, apothecaries handed out herbal tonics and tinctures, valerian root, poppy syrup, and sometimes a little something extra if you were well connected. The wealthy could afford elaborate preparations. The poor made do with prayer, ale, and sheer exhaustion. Either way, nobody was particularly good at solving the problem. The Victorians, of course, tried to industrialize sleep. They introduced mass-market sedatives, each one more dangerous than the last. Chloral hydrate, laudanum, bromides, medicine that knocked you out, or at least knocked you sideways. Doctors insisted it was modern progress. Meanwhile, patients woke up groggy, addicted, and occasionally dead. At the same time, people filled their bedrooms with gadgets. Patent medicine machines buzzed, hummed, and promised restful nights. It was half science, half theater, and mostly useless. But Victorians loved gadgets. Then the 20th century arrived with its laboratories. Now sleep could be measured, graphed, and quantified. Electrodes on the scalp, brainwaves scrolling across paper. Finally, sleep was no longer mystical, it was clinical. And yet, insomnia remained stubborn. We cycled through barbiturates, benzodiazepines and drugs, each one hailed as a miracle, each one eventually revealed to be problematic. It's almost a ritual in itself. Science announces victory, patients line up, and then inevitably side effects sneak in. Meanwhile, ordinary people clung to their own routines. White noise machines, herbal teas, lavender-scented pillows, everyone with their private bedtime ritual, hoping for that elusive moment of rest. And now, in the 21st century, we've turned back to the oldest remedy of all, storytelling. sleep podcasts, bedtime audiobooks, voices reading calmly for hours. It's not so different from the ancient lullabies sung beside Mesopotamian cradles. Only now, you can stream one from your phone at 2 a.m. while scrolling through Insomnia forums. So what's the pattern? Why does insomnia cling to us so stubbornly? Maybe it's because sleep is the one thing you can't force. The harder you chase it, the further it slips away. Every culture has tried through magic, medicine, or sheer willpower, and every culture has, in the end, surrendered to the same truth. Sometimes you just don't sleep. There's also a certain irony here. Humans have always been obsessed with controlling everything. We conquered fire, built cities, mapped the stars, but sleep, still untamable, still slightly mysterious, still slipping out of reach, no matter how many electrodes or pills we throw at it. It's one of the few things that makes us feel like ancient people again, a shared helplessness that crosses centuries. If you zoom out, there's also comfort in this. You're not alone in your restlessness. Every generation has had its sleepless nights. Kings, peasants, monks, soldiers, they all lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for dawn. Even the most powerful emperors couldn't always command themselves to sleep. Their crowns didn't help them much at 3 a.m., and maybe that's why the history of insomnia is oddly soothing. It reminds us that sleeplessness isn't failure, it isn't weakness, it's just human. Whether you're clutching a poppy syrup bottle in Victorian London, or refreshing your phone under blue LED glow, you're part of the same long tradition, one that stretches back to the first humans who looked at the stars and thought, not again, why am I still awake? So tonight, if you're still awake, don't worry, you've got good company. The ghosts of monks, kings and poets are right there with you, restless, fidgeting, trying their best remedies, some with herbs, some with prayers, some with Ambien. None of them entirely successful, and yet, eventually, they all slept. Not because they solved it, but because the body always wins in the end. Sleep arrives when it feels like it, indifferent to your rituals, patient but inevitable. So, let's close this wandering story where we began. Humans, in every age, have feared the night, and humans, in every age, have searched for ways to soften it. Charms, syrups, pills, and podcasts, they're all part of the same restless effort. And while the remedies change, the experience remains. Sleeplessness has always been with us, but so, eventually, has sleep. So take a breath, settle in, let the centuries drift past, and if you're lucky, let go. Good night.